I'm Rob Breakenridge for nationalpost.com and NP Comment. It's a new book that makes a strong case that there's been a real shift, a real backlash against progressive politics in many Western countries, or more specifically what we refer to as wokeness, and that the pendulum is definitely shifting in the other direction. Brendan O'Neill is chief political writer at Spiked, and he's the author of the new book. It's called Vibe Shift, The Revolt Against Wokeness, Greenism, and Technocracy. Brendan O'Neill, so great to have you with us here.
Thanks, Rob. A pleasure.
So first of all, we talk about wokeness as a sort of a specific form of progressive politics. It really doesn't have much to do with kind of the economics of the left, much more on social issues, and some of those, you obviously delve into in the book. But what do you take that to mean, first of all? What are we talking about when we talk about wokeness?
Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? People often say that. What the hell are you talking about when you talk about wokeness? Because I talk about wokeness all the time. And I must say that sometimes when I'm cornered and asked to explain what it means, I do get a little bit stumped because it feels like an ideology that is unnameable or unpin downable. It's kind of very free floating and shape shifting, and it molds itself around different issues and in different institutions. So it can be hard to pinpoint. It can be hard to accurately describe. And of course, very few people openly call themselves woke. It has become a largely pejorative term now. It's not as if people are on the street saying we're woke and we're proud. It has become a bit of an insult. But to me, it means a kind of distorted progressive politics. So it's not left-wing politics as we traditionally understood it. It's not a politics that is concerned with class or concerned with improving the economic conditions of working people. That would be the kind of traditional left. But nor is it even the kind of liberal left of the 60s and 70s, which were concerned with more identity politics, but in a positive way, pushing forward women's choice, for example, or gay liberation, or trying to ensure that minority groups are treated fairly in society, are not discriminated against, are not oppressed. I don't think it has anything to do with either of those traditional understandings of a kind of left or radical politics. It's more a kind of, I think it's a regressive politics that dresses itself up as progressive. It is a very authoritarian politics. It's a very unforgiving politics. It enforces cancel culture against anyone who deviates from its diktats. It embraces lunatic post-truth ideas, such as that you or I, Rob, could become a woman tomorrow simply by declaring ourselves to be a woman. And it is a politics that is very post-class, very post-liberal, and it's a kind of new authoritarianism, a kind of moral glue for a new establishment. I think that's probably a bit of a long-winded, but the way I understand it.
Right. I think objectively you can see where there's been a pushback or a backlash. I wonder to the extent, that this has occurred, because I think there's some who go even further and say, this is sort of a permanent defeat for wokeism. Wokeism is dead, that we've all moved on. But maybe you don't quite see it that way.
I wish it was dead. I can't help feeling that the death of wokeness has been greatly exaggerated. I think it's definitely suffered some serious blows. And that's kind of what my short book is about. It's about the shifting of the vibe rather than the death of wokeness. There have been some books on the end of woke by Andrew Doyle and the I think also Piers Morgan's book is called Woke is Dead or something like that. Right. Yeah. And I've got time for both of those commentators. I think they're both very good observers of contemporary life. But I do think it's exaggerated to say that woke is over. I think it's too sewn into our institutions. I mean, the example I always give is the UK. The UK is known as Turf Island because we have lots of gender-critical feminists who've been pushing back against certain trans ideas, and certainly the crazier trans ideas. People like J.K. Rowling and many, many others have been pushing back against that. And they've scored some really important successes, and I talk about them in my book. So, for example, a Supreme Court ruling here in the UK last year, which just outlined what all of us once knew, which is that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. These are important legal victories, but at the same time, that ideology is still very influential in schools. There's a discussion in the UK this week about the right of boys in schools to wear whatever clothes they want, to change their name, to potentially use the changing room of the opposite sex. That ideology is still very influential in universities. So it feels a little bit like one step forward, two steps back, or maybe, to be more optimistic, two steps forward, one step back, because I do think wokeness is still there in influential circles, in the institutions of education. It's still influencing the next generation of leaders. But in the real world, amongst ordinary people, that's where I think it has suffered some serious blows.
And it's interesting that this is happening. You talk about what's happening in the UK. We see it in the United States. We see it here in Canada. That pushback is sort of happening simultaneously. Is that kind of a consequence of our connected world? Is it a bit of a coincidence? What do you make of these trends?
Yeah, I think it is a consequence of the connected world. I mean, just as wokeness itself spread around the world because of all these new connections that we have in the digital era, I think so the pushback against it will be global as well. At least I hope it will be. But you're right, we are seeing pushbacks against it in different countries, in the US, in Canada, across Europe. We're seeing the rise of populist parties in different European countries as people reject the kind of woke globalism of the past 2 or 3 decades, and they're looking for something else. I do think there is a real influence of ideas, a spread of ideas in a really interesting way. I mean, one of the topics I talk about in my book is the pushback against net zero, and I would call it a people's revolt against climate change alarmism. That's a very real phenomenon in Europe. I fear that it doesn't get enough coverage around the world. The National Post has covered it, and I'm sure other sensible outlets have as well over the past 5 or 6 years, but not sufficiently in some cases. And this is an uprising of farmers, an uprising of motorists. There was a revolt of construction workers in Poland where they marched through the streets chanting, the Green Deal, if you'll excuse my language. I mean, you know, genuine people's uprisings against the kind of deathly cult of net zero and the idea that the end times are upon us unless we cut back carbon emissions by a certain amount before 2035. There's a real revolt against that idea, and that has spread through Europe in an extraordinary way, from the Gilets jaunes in France, who rose up against an eco-tax on driving, through to Dutch farmers and German farmers, and then right through to construction workers in Eastern Europe. It's so interesting that you have these very different constituencies, but a shared idea that it's time to push back against dangerous ideologies.
And it's interesting because I think on that issue, and we can get into the borders and immigration issue too, I think there's some underlying economic factors there where that's driving a lot of this shift in public opinion. I think it's some of these other issues, like on the gender issues, it's less about economics than I think it is about other things. What do you think is fueling this pushback? Why has there been such a shift or a revolt against this?
That's a really good point. I agree that there's an economic factor in the rising up against net zero, because people just feel the pinch. They feel that, you know, their wages, their jobs, their ability to farm and make food, all of that is being undermined by this kind of climate change lunacy, I think we can call it. So there's an economic dynamic there for sure. When it comes to the pushback against the gender ideology, I think there are different things going on there. It's a very interesting array of women, primarily women in the UK and in other parts of Europe who've risen up against this. There are working class women in the UK, for example. Over the past year, there have been numerous cases where nurses have had to fight in the courts for the right to their own single-sex changing room. Various nurses around the UK have insisted on the right to change away from men, which used to be a fundamental right of women at work, but that was burnt at the altar of the gender ideology. So you have these kind of working class women demanding basic safety and dignity in the workplace, and it goes right up through to influential commentators, academics, women in professional institutions who've also pushed back against it. I think in that case, it's really an example of wokeness just pushing that bit too far. I mean, we could go back 10 years and you would find that most people just didn't have a problem with men who dressed as women or women who dressed as men. It was seen as fine, you know, self-expression, knock yourself out, call yourself what you want, wear what you want. That isn't a problem. But when those activists started pushing into the changing rooms and the domestic violence shelters and the institutions of the opposite sex, and when they started demanding that we all bow down and recognize their pronouns and use their correct pronouns and validate their gender, that's when it overstepped the mark, because then it was less about their own freedom of expression and it was more about forcing the rest of us to genuflect to their ideology. So it went from being a pretty freewheeling libertine movement to being a very authoritarian one. So I think in the case of trans, that's a very good example. I talk in my book about how there comes a crunch point in society when people just think, well, the elites have gone too far. We're not putting up with this anymore. And that can often give rise to this just quite instinctive revolt amongst ordinary people against what they see as an overbearing presence in their life.
And it's interesting too, because I think a lot of these people and women especially have been pushing back against this, speaking out. A generation ago, these would have been seen as progressives, as feminists, those who are defending women's rights and women's equality. And this kind of gets back to your point about how this has all been upended, that now somehow that's viewed as ultra right wing somehow.
Oh, yeah. Old style feminists have led the charge against the gender ideology in the UK. I mean, I've been standing on the barricades with some of those women over the past 5 years, but I would disagree with them on many, many things. Right. Historically speaking, I believe in women's equality, but I'm not a fan of modern day feminism. I think it's often sometimes a misanthropic ideology. It's sometimes a bit too anti-men for my liking, a bit too anti-working class as well. So I would have a million disagreements with some of these activists on feminism and its role in society, but I completely agree with them that sex is real, that women deserve sex-based rights, that they should have their own spaces free of men, they should enjoy freedom of association. I fundamentally agree with them on all of those points. But yeah, the charge was led by feminists, by women who've been in this game for a long time, fighting for women's rights and women's equality. And I think that's a good example of how wokeness often poses as the new civil rights movement. So Black Lives Matter posed as the heir to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. Trans activism often poses as the heir to the gay liberation movements of the 1970s. You often have this, they pull on the guise of the kind of progressive movements of the past, but in fact, they're often pursuing very regressive ideas, very backward ideas, and very authoritarian ideas as well. So what these feminists and others in the UK have managed to do very successfully is rip off the mask of gender ideology and expose the truth that lies underneath it, which is that this is often a very misogynistic movement. This is a movement that in which men demand access to women's spaces, in which men have threatened women for speaking out of turn, for using the supposedly wrong pronouns, for example, and in which men, let's be honest about it, men dressed as women have hounded women off campuses and out of the workplace for the crime of wrongthink, for refusing to bow down to these new ideas. So in that case, I think it's of a piece with the suffragette movement of the 1910s and the struggle for the women's right to work in the 1960s and the 1970s. I really do see the feminist pushback against the gender ideology as being on a par with those things, because it is about rescuing the idea of women's rights from this whirlwind of ideology that kind of really started to destroy them.
Let me also ask you about the issue around, issues around immigration and borders, because look, here in Canada, there's been a real backlash against how immigration was mismanaged under Justin Trudeau, the huge spike in numbers and just how badly that was all handled. I think you see it in the US, you see it in the UK and elsewhere. Why does this stand out to you as one of those key issues?
Yeah, the anger in the UK about mass immigration and our broken borders is just extraordinary. I mean, you hear it every single day. My WhatsApp groups are always buzzing with people saying, have you seen this story of an illegal immigrant who did this to this woman? I mean, people are so angry about this issue, and it is the driving force of political life in this country right now. The reason that Reform UK, which is Nigel Farage's populist party, the reason they are now the #1 party in every poll is because people want a reckoning with the destruction of our borders, with the sacrifice of British sovereignty to the ideals of globalism. That's essentially what has happened in the UK and other European countries over the past few decades, and people are sick of it. So it really has struck me as one of the flashpoints of the vibe shift. And in fact, last year in the UK, there was this movement called Operation Raise the Colours, where people up and down the country, especially in working class communities, started raising the British flag and the St. George's flag, which is the flag of England. They just started raising them on lampposts and putting them on street corners all across the country. Thousands and thousands of people started raising the national flag. And of course, this caused absolute terror in Whitehall and amongst the woke elites, because they think the national flag is gross and a bit racist and it reminds us of empire and all that kind of nonsense. But that really was ordinary people reclaiming national pride, reclaiming a sense of patriotism, reclaiming pride in the nation after a couple of decades of us being told that British history is just a litany of crimes against humanity and we should constantly self-flagellate for the horrors of the past and check our white privilege and apologise for being British. I mean, that's the culture of self-loathing that we've been subjected to for the past couple of decades. And ordinary people really took a stand against that last year. And I think they're going to do it in the next general election as well. They are going to vote for reform, large numbers of people are anyway, as a way of re-establishing a sense that, you know, the nation is a thing to be proud of. Our flag is a thing to be proud of. So that to me represents a very clear uprising of common sense, of ordinary people against the elite ideology of national self-loathing. And I find it incredibly positive.
I mean, and is that populism? And I think in a way, populism almost has taken on a negative context. But I mean, do you see it that way? How do you frame the populism question around this shift that we're seeing?
Yeah, I love the word populist. I'm trying to save it from being turned into a dirty word. Because if you look up the word populist in the Oxford Dictionary, it basically means ideas that are popular or policies that are popular. That's fundamentally what it means. And that's probably why the word strikes such terror into the hearts of the old establishment, because they hate things that are popular. They hate political policies that are popular. They think there must be something wrong if ordinary people are in favour of these ideas. Yeah, I call myself a populist. I think populism has done some wonderful things. It's an unpredictable beast. If you look at Trump, for example, I think Trumpism is a good example of how powerful populism can be, but also how unpredictable it can be. And the Trump administration has a tendency to kind of flit from one issue to another and doesn't have a particularly clear intellectual project. But I still understand why 77 million Americans opted to use Trump as a kind of cudgel against the old establishment. That makes perfect sense to me. But if you look at what's happened in the UK, really since 2016, when we voted for Brexit, when we voted to leave the European Union in June 2016, the largest democratic vote in the history of this country, 17.4 million people voted against the EU. I was one of them. I'm very proud to have been. To my mind, that was the start of the modern era of populism, because that had, not only did that cause an earthquake in Europe, I think it had repercussions around the world, because it was so unexpected. Virtually the entire establishment, the business elites, the political elites and the liberal media had all said, we're voting Remain, everyone must vote Remain. And then ordinary people, especially in the left behind communities, in working class communities that have been neglected for the past few decades, those communities voted in their millions to leave the European Union. They defied the establishment and went their own way. And that really did represent a break with the old politics. I think that was the final nail in the coffin of establishment politics. Even though establishment politics has lingered on like a zombie since then, I think it really was the death knell for that old way of doing things. So I'm pretty happy to call myself a populist. I think populism is still growing and thriving and doing interesting, strange things in Europe. We're seeing populist parties rise up everywhere. Now even as far as Japan and, of course, Argentina and in different parts of the world, increasingly in Australia, where there's a party called One Nation, which seems to be nipping at the heels of the traditional Liberal Party there. I think across the world, people have had enough of politics as usual, and they want to try something a bit different.
Well, the book is available now. It's out. It's called Vibe Shift, The Revolt Against Wokeness, Greenism, and Technocracy. Brendan O'Neill, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks, Rob.
My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks for joining us on this episode. Much more at nationalpost.com.